Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the AI Spy. If you haven't subscribed yet or haven't checked out our last episode, please go do so. In the last episode, we spoke to Brian Denny and Kathy Waters from Advocating Against Romance Scammers. That was our episode around Valentine's Day. It's a great episode. We dive into many topics around the Section 221G of the Constitution, how social media platforms can do much better to stop romance scams. So great, we're back again with another exciting episode, another A-lister. Joining me today is the co-founder of Overwatch Data, Zara Perumal. Zara, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you. I've been following you on LinkedIn for a while now. I find your posts very, very interesting and insightful. So thank you for taking the time out and talking to me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I similarly love your work, and I love how much you bring like the real stories from all sorts of practitioners. So I have the romance scam episode I need to re-listen to, but I'm super excited to be here.
A little known fact, I don't know if it is a little known fact, I was featured in Forbes magazine, 30 under 30. Zara, I don't even know what I was doing in my 30s. How did you achieve that? It's a great way to get into our origin story. So what got you into cybersecurity and how did you find your way into open source intelligence?
Yeah, well, on the Forbes thing, I think a lot of a lot of luck. But I think for me, like I love technology from an early age. My dad was actually a software developer, so he tried to get me and my brothers all tried to see if any of us were interested in it, and I loved it. I felt like it was really fun. You know, you get to build, you get like I love how you can kind of just imagine projects in your brain. You just kind of write them down and you see them in real life. But then I went through a lot of phases throughout college of trying to figure out what I like to do. And originally I was more on the software app development side, but I took this cybersecurity class my senior spring of college, and I thought it was incredible. I thought it was so interesting, like the different layers of which people can attack systems, from everything looking at like these side channel attacks, looking at like energy usage to the cryptography. And I thought it was amazing, but also I was like a little bit intimidated by it, whereas, I felt like, well, I don't know if I can do this. I'm more of a software developer. But I was lucky to work with an incredible professor, with Ron Rivest, and he was just so encouraging and made it feel so accessible that really everyone has a role you can play in cybersecurity. There's so many problems to solve. And so I was absolutely hooked. I spent my master's doing a mix of sort of what I knew at the time, which is the software development and machine learning and cybersecurity. So we did projects like active learning for malware detection with Kalyan at the LIDS lab at MIT. And then after that, I went to Google. So I originally worked on Google Assistant doing sort of natural language understanding type of work, more on the machine learning side, and then moved to Google's threat analysis group. There, it was a really cool mission. We tracked state-sponsored hacking, like influence operations, some of the big financially motivated crime groups. And it was really interesting seeing like how you could use like the latest in AI and software development to really scale intelligence teams. And so I absolutely love the work. But I had sort of this startup idea where I always wanted to, try being a startup founder and building something from scratch. And one of the problems we were seeing there is you think about there's so much work that goes into understanding things like malware and how you recursively unpack it and you mine it for these really interesting signals. But when it comes to things like OSINT or chatter, you see people pretty blatantly, like they go on YouTube comments and they basically like join our Telegram group and continue the discussion about crime here. But when you look through a lot of the current tools in the OSINT space are very keyword search based, and so we found them very hard to use. The return on investment, there's a lot of investment for very little return. And so we're thinking about these types of problems and noticing, with all these developments in AI, there's a huge opportunity here. And so after that, took the jump and ended up founding Overwatch with Arjun.
I remember for me when I was still in high school, I got introduced. It'll show my age, but I was learning programming in Basic, and we wrote Basic, and not even Basic. I think it was Logo. Initially, it was Logo, and then we transitioned to Basic. In Logo, you could do pen up, pen down command, so you can move the pixel 50 pixels up. You could draw a triangle,
Yeah.
and those are the basic commands. The first day I drew a perfect square, I was like, wow, this is so interesting. I can write something and I can build it. And I can see it immediately. So that's where I got hooked into software engineering. It seems like
Yeah.
those intelligence. But you mentioned something. You spoke about founding Overwatch Data, that you always wanted to be a to be a founder. So talk about some of the challenges, but also talk about some of the more rewarding stuff, so that anyone listening can get inspired. But what are the challenges of founding and scaling a
Yeah, I think one of the lucky things is when I joined, I had no idea what the challenges would be. I was just like, I love the idea where I was like, I like the idea of building for yourself. I think to what you just said on like how you came into programming, that's how I felt a lot about software is I feel like for me, it's like one of the most creative things I can do. I'm maybe not a traditional artist, but I love that you can just build stuff and you go test it with users and you hear a problem and you can find, how can we solve it? And I love that aspect of it. And I felt like I liked the idea of startups because I was like, then, you have more of a say of trying to figure out what you build versus implementing within a larger organization. There's usually people who have a much better sense of what you should build than especially a more junior employee. And I think for me, like, it's interesting because it's the most, especially being on the CTO side, you build a lot. So it's, you're, in some ways, it's the most tired I've ever been. There's like some really long nights, but it's also the most excited. Like I do generally wake up like every day really excited. And I think for me, like, it's interesting because in terms of the challenges that I didn't expect, I mean, there's obviously just a lot of work. Like the numbers of hours increases a lot. But I think the biggest thing was like the uncertainty and how do you think about, because the biggest question early on is like, how do we find something that's useful to people to build, something that's like actually solves a real problem for them? There's an infinite, especially in the space that we're in, there's like kind of an infinite amount of problems we can solve. So how do we figure out like what's the right problem to solve? And then build something deep enough there that is actually useful, especially to big organizations. And so thinking about like getting just used to like making decisions very quickly, like thinking about different ways to approach the problem. Maybe the problem isn't a software problem. Maybe it's a problem where you need to get more people's opinions and talk to more users or talk to a partner who might have a better solution on how to solve it. And so I think that was one of the things that was really interesting for me to get used to is just, dealing, like living in the uncertainty and sort of embracing it versus getting overwhelmed or stuck in this, like, how do we, there's like 50 things that are on fire, 50 problems. How do we not get stuck in that?
So let's talk a little bit about the blog that you write. I think it's part of the Overwatch website. I'm going to add the link into the show notes and description so others can read it too. So it's called Telegram Tuesdays. And Telegram, I think, over time has become the go-to platform of choice for scammers, for fraudsters to discuss. So are there other such platforms and how are they leveraging?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting because to your point, there's like plenty of options available from everything from building a dark web. You can go to a dark web forum and post if you're selling something or looking for something. You can set up your own dark web site. You could go on Signal. You could go on, people do stuff on Facebook, TikTok. And so there's all these platforms, but it does seem like Telegram is this uniquely good opportunity for fraud because it's so easy to use. And so the combination of what seems like a historic, like very little content moderation or takedowns of crime accounts and how easy it is to get up and running. I think for the same reason that, me as a user, software developer, like you're like, if I can just like create, like post my content on LinkedIn, then why would I go through the effort of like making some giant site? So that ease of use, I think, has this incredible, like that. I think that's like the big reason why people are using that versus the dark web. But it's also snowballed into, there's so much of the fraud community there. So, even with Google search, you can find Telegram accounts that are selling all sorts of stuff from like fraud as a service to bricking, like violence as a service. When you join a channel, there's so many other channels that are listed. They have these sort of sales channels where people, it's like a marketplace. And so everyone in that channel is like offering or asking for some like illicit service. And so it's really wild. Like it's just this entire ecosystem that's built off of like how easy it is to just spin up a group and then get more people to join the group.
Yep, I was reading recently. There's this. I think it's Cambodian, if I'm not wrong. It starts with an H. I'm going to mispronounce it. But do you know what I'm talking about? The Huanaim or Huamain or something. It's similar. I butchered the pronunciation, but I'll put. I was reading this article. It's a service for scam and money laundering. So they will set you up with all the tools, and in fact they'll help you launder. Fraud as a service or money laundering as a service has evolved, and like you said, it's the go-to. It's their go-to destination. But one of your posts that on LinkedIn that I found interesting is inadvertently, it's not their intention, but while they are marketing this, they actually reveal their tactics.
Yeah.
So how monitoring these channels can also help.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I'm all generally, and I don't know if everyone else feels this way, but I'm sort of always fascinated by how much the fraud community sellers like kind of mimic like real world startups. So for them, they all are anonymous, so they can't put their real world identity. You can't say like I met this person, they seem to be real. But they have this problem of now that we're anonymous and people can make this very similar looking handle or channel. How do we prove our value? And one of the things that they do is they'll try to post evidence of their work. So maybe if they are an account takeover vendor, they'll post a screenshot of the account they took over. If they're selling fraud as a service, maybe they want to post a quick guide of like, here's like 4 steps of fraud, or here's a PDF you can download that proves that like I really know my stuff. And so because they do that, and it works quite well for them, they do that and then they establish this credibility and their brand that they, spew all over with emojis or their names. But to your point, when you monitor that, if you can actually find those needles in the haystack, you can find things like identifiers of which account was stolen, or you can find identifiers of this is the fraud method that everyone's talking about and learning from. How do we, as a business, how do we like shut down that fraud method and make sure we're hearted or have detection rules to detect that? So it's kind of this interesting cat and mouse where I think, sometimes the hard part is finding those relevant results in the chatter, but because the fraud community has so much education to each other to like embrace new fraud people and a lot of selling to each other, there's a lot that's like pretty rich that you can find there.
Perfect. So I remember when I was following check fraud, so
Yeah.
in the 2022, 2 years ago, and I think it's still very prevalent. Check fraud is still very prevalent, but usage of dark web to sell stolen checks is still highly relevant. So they would post the checks, saying that these are all the checks that we cleared, and then they would show the bundles of cash that they were able to withdraw
Yeah.
from stolen and fabricated checks. They had a term; it was called glass. They would call stolen checks as glass. You know it better than me, but because it's guaranteed to clear. So those were some of the tactics. But then David Maimon and others who were following were able to crack. I think there was a lot of good intelligence came out of that. So even some of the counterfeit detection techniques came out of monitoring. So yeah, there's a huge benefit in monitoring those. In one of your blogs, you talk about the shift from reactive to proactive strategies by merging decision intelligence and open source intelligence. What are the two approaches, and how can FIs, financial institutions, start using open source intelligence?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think to your point, also it's often very hard to use. I share that feeling, and especially when you like you join, you're like, okay, there's bad stuff happening, but can we do anything about that? But I think it's interesting. So I think about like completely reactive. Like if you got hit by fraud, like let's say we had, let's say 1,000 users join our platform and they're all fake, or they all signed up with fake credit cards, or however they did that. The reactive approach is you wait until you're hit by it, and then you're trying to back out happen. But ideally, you have some sort of early warning, or you have it's coming to some way, so you have like ability to prevent it. The other thing I was thinking of is I think a lot of times with both cybersecurity and fraud, and I'm not sure if this is a hot take, but I think it's actually like a not solvable problem where there's always an infinite of ways of where attackers will find to get around our systems, in part due to how the internet is set up and designed. But you can never solve all of the cybersecurity problems. So I think for some people that's very depressing. For me, I actually think it's very freeing, because then you're in a world where you're like, okay, how do we make the best of it? And I think that's, to me, what threat intelligence should be doing is how do we prioritize the highest risk or the most severe or the most prevalent attacks? How do we listen and stay ahead of the tactics so that we're covering our bases and doing the best we can to have deep defenses where we need deep defenses? And that's what I think, like, when you think about something like a lot of traditional cyber threat intelligence, it's thinking about like the big players. You think about like big ransomware groups or big APTs. But a lot of this, especially for fraud, a lot of the chatter is just like this incredibly high volume, millions of dollars in checks, like millions of posts related to financial institutions every day, that is just so blatantly shared. And it's the more simple techniques of things like saying, I have credentials, employee credentials, I have a user credential, I have a PDF that guides on how to commit referral fraud, or how to do account takeover, or cash out. And so I think that's one thing is, some of the more practical things, like the easiest things, is sometimes these, especially the Telegram people, will blatantly share account details. So they'll say that here's a stolen account, a stolen credit card. They'll share a screenshot that can be identified. And those are some of the like most practical, like you can definitely do something with that. Or the stolen checks, if the account number is on a stolen check, we can take it down. But then there's more exotic stuff. So depending on people's appetite, you can also try to go into the methodology. So can you identify a fraud ring? Can you take the approach that they're doing? So if they share step-by-step instructions, can you translate that into a detection rule or an identity rule to say like, this is just a fishy theme of behavior? And then if you use that, then you can often take down even more accounts. So you can say like, these are this large network of accounts that are actively committing fraud, or sometimes there's like these mules that are people who are involved in fraud that may be like half malicious, half benign. But I think that's one of the interesting stuff in this space is I honestly think that before some of the recent advancements in AI, it was just so much work to mine for those signals. It was just like maybe wasn't always worth it. But now like there's so much that we can do in terms of like researching what the channel does, what the threat actor does. I think it's a really good time to sort of actively make use of this data.
But it's something you said. I don't think it's a hot take. I think you are spot on that it's not an unsolvable problem, but it's a problem that will keep evolving.
Yeah.
One of my mentors, he came from the police. He used to be he's a retired policeman now, works in fraud detection. He told me something that when he would he would go after criminals, he would try to arrest them. The feedback he would always get from the criminals is that a criminal is an artist and a policeman is a critic. So in many ways, these criminals, they are artists. They're constantly refining the techniques, evolving new techniques, learning from us, saying what are the fraud prevention. One of the I think David Maimon posted it also that the fraudsters are testing out some of the fraud prevention tools and saying that our checks or our identity, the identity can't beat these
Yeah.
solution providers. So I'm like, wow, they're actually putting so much effort in doing market research, in understanding what are the prevention techniques and how to beat them. So we constantly need to up our game as well, and that's what makes working in cybersecurity fraud prevention so interesting, because it keeps evolving and there's new threats every day. There's new patterns to learn and prevent. Talking about those patterns evolving, what are some of the new trends that you've seen recently, or with so much technology? I don't want to use the word agents, but has that creeped into the web and agents for hire now?
Yeah, I feel like there's so many trends. I think I'll start with one that's like less AI before we jump
Excellent.
all the way down the rabbit hole. But I feel like generally I think the sophistication is generally increasing, especially with these fraud groups. I think there's a lot of money to be made, and there's a general like more and more people joining, or more people having the sort of access and opportunity. Like if maybe they already have motive to commit the frauds, but now they're having the ability to commit fraud with a lot of these tools. One of the weird trends we see, like you see a lot of times there's sort of these fraud tools or tactics that are in silos. So you might think of something like a credential dump gives you the username and password. I think we're generally seeing that become a bit more sophisticated and connected, where if you use the credential dump for the username and password, maybe now there's a Telegram phishing bot that will go get the one-time password for you. You combine that with other tools like Stealer logs or these anti-detect browsers that allow you to impersonate like the full login credentials and identity. And I think one of the things that is kind of interesting is seeing a lot more people tying all those tools together to make these like really hard to detect attacks, even though what the tools they're using are like publicly available, relatively simple. And so I think that's one general trend. I think in terms of like the more futuristic stuff, I think they are very fast to adopt like AI and agents. And last year we saw them. I think most startups hadn't done their RAG or fine-tuned system, and they had launched like Fraud GPT, all of these like crazy L's. And I think the first wave was I think everyone was just trying to figure out what to do with it, where people are trying to say like maybe use it for fraud education. Like you don't know how to make a scam page, Fraud GPT will help you do that.
Yeah.
And sort of reducing the barrier to entry for fraud. I think now we're seeing sort of this era of like really good social engineering. So a lot of people doing like the voice clone scams, like they might call a grandmother and pretend to be the child. You also see stuff like the, text and SMS phishing is getting maybe a little bit better, and definitely at a lot more scale, where if you combine it with taking data from a data breach with also knowing your phone number, maybe it's a little bit more targeted to me referencing like my
Yeah.
family or my co-founder. So I think that's sort of like one era we're going into. But I think there's also some crazier stuff when you think about the agents, like how can they connect these tools together? So if you're doing account takeover, can you use a browser agent to look at the look at the account, test credentials. And I think that's something that I suspect we'll see as time goes on, not only an increase in things like deepfakes and identity fraud, but also these more autonomous systems where they can like run these really scaled attacks with higher sophistication than we've seen before.
Scary time,
Yeah.
exciting time, but scary time to be live. So finally, I want to, I've taken too much of your time, but as a wrap up, do you have any advice for individuals who are interested in cybersecurity? And also maybe one piece of advice for someone who's starting a company. So two-part question.
Yeah, I think I have so many thoughts, so I'll try to curate them a little bit. I feel like for cybersecurity, I mean, first and foremost, there's an incredible gap of people. Like, we just need way more people in cybersecurity to block bad actors. People always post about the skills shortage, and so if you have the passion for it and you're the interest in the field, there's absolutely a place for you, and you should join. It also there's so many areas of it. So I think for me, like getting exposed to do you like incident response? Do you like threat intelligence? Do you like compliance? I think getting a feel for the different sectors as much as you can. And then I think the other thing that for me, I was someone who joined, it wasn't always working in cybersecurity, but one of the most fun things I think for me is just staying curious and keep learning, because there's an infinite amount of stuff to learn. And, as we were talking about, it always evolves. So if you, stick, like what you learned 5 years ago has now changed. So I think that's both the wonderful and the, challenging part of working in this field. I think on startups, I mean, honestly, I think it's a similar thing where if you have the passion for it, you should absolutely consider doing it. For me, I knew I wanted to do it, but I wasn't sure, like, how do you de-risk it? Because if you look, if you're if some sort of finance background and you look risk adjusted, it's a bad idea. The variance is so high. So for me, I thought about, like, how do I control that risk? And also, how do I make sure that even if it fails, that I would be happy doing it? And I think some of the things I thought about is, is it a passion, is a problem that I care so much about that if I'm working on the weekends or working late at night, I'm actually excited? Is it with people that you feel you have the similar values and sort of complement each other? And then is it also is like a problem that I'm not only passionate, but is a good fit for my skill set? And so I tried to think about those types of things as a way to sort of de-risk, give myself the best chance to work on something that I have impact on. But I also think for me, like for where I was, I wanted a place where I could learn and grow. And I was just really excited about how do I have more impact and how do I grow as a person? And the amount of different problems that you're exposed to in startups, I think it was honestly mind blowing. And so for me, I've had an incredible, like, in that perspective of like when you frame it as like this is an incredible opportunity to grow, to learn, to hopefully have impact, it really keeps me going and really, like, makes you feel very fortunate and lucky to be in this place with this opportunity to try to build something, versus focusing too much on the more negative or the uncertainty or the large amounts of work. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Zara, thank you. Thank you for taking time out today. Thank you for sharing your insights. Some of the details that you shared around open source intelligence, how financial institutions can use them, extremely useful. I learned a lot. Hopefully, all the listeners will too. So, to everyone listening, that's a wrap on today's episode. We'll be back again with another A-lister, another expert to discuss matters of artificial intelligence and prevention. Zara, again, thank you so much for joining.